You know that old metaphor, right? Like you put a frog in a pot of boiling water and it jumps right out.
Yeah, the classic boiling frog.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you put it in tepid water
Yeah.
and just slowly turn up the heat, it just sits there. It adapts. It normalizes the rising temperature until it's literally boiled alive.
Right.
And it's a cliche, sure, but today we are taking that exact concept and applying it to a question that, honestly, it completely reorients how you look at global power right now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, frankly, it's a question that challenges the foundational assumptions of modern geopolitics.
It really does. So our mission for today's deep dive is to unpack this incredibly dense, just fascinating analysis from the May 2026 edition of the Global Review.
Written by Fareed Novin, right?
Yes, Fareed Novin. And he looks at the incredibly chaotic state of the world right now and asks this provocative question, like, is China deliberately turning up the heat to boil the United States through this calculated gradual pressure?
Right.
Or is the U.S. simply leaving the stove on itself through its own systemic overextension?
And to really grasp the weight of Novin's analysis, we have to ground ourselves in the present reality of, well, May 2026.
Right.
Because the geopolitical landscape has fundamentally shifted in just the last few months alone.
Yeah, because we are all currently watching the dust settle from Operation Epic Fury.
Yeah.
This massive 40-day military conflict with Iran.
Exactly.
And the fallout is everywhere. I mean, if you are listening to this, you probably notice how chaotic the news cycle feels right now.
It's overwhelming.
It really is. We're
Yeah.
seeing fractured alliances, wild economic volatility, and a U.S. defense industrial base that is it's flashing red.
Right.
So this deep dive is about connecting all those seemingly isolated dots for you.
Because, the core of this analysis isn't just about troop movements or military strategy in a vacuum. It is really a study of asymmetric architecture.
Okay, asymmetric architecture.
Yeah, it's about how money, diplomatic trust, and critically, how time operates differently for different great powers.
Right, time is a resource.
Exactly. The most important takeaway here is that structural vulnerabilities, like the invisible scaffolding of global power, often dictate the outcome long before a single missile is even fired.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we want to understand the boiling water, we first need to examine the cracks in the pot itself. Okay?
That's a good way to put it.
And the report starts with America's oldest, most rigid structural advantage, which is NATO. The text highlights this crucial detail. The U.S. did not consult NATO or G7 frameworks before launching Operation Epic Fury against Iran.
They bypass them entirely.
Right. It's like living with a roommate for 80 years and suddenly they just change the locks without asking, but they still expect you to pay half the rent.
That is a very apt analogy.
It fundamentally changes who holds the structural power.
It does, and it describes the structural degradation occurring in the transatlantic relationship right now. I mean, it's not just about bruised egos. It is about a literal shift in operational control.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the text traces a very specific sequence here. Following that unconsulted launch against Iran, the Trump administration placed immense pressure on European allies to either explicitly endorse or directly participate in the campaign.
And what happened?
Well, across the European political spectrum, the answer was just a firm refusal.
Wow. Which feels like a massive historical pivot.
Oh, it is. French President Emmanuel Macron explicitly warned that Washington's unilateral conduct was, quote, corroding the foundational norms of the alliance.
Eroding the norms.
Yeah. And we saw NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte absent from key early White House briefings during those critical initial weeks.
Which is wild to think about.
But the mechanical shift, the handing over of the keys, as you put it earlier, that's the most significant part. The report indicates the U.S. effectively began ceding command of key NATO structures.
Right.
Specifically, the Allied Joint Command in Naples and Joint Force Command Norfolk are transitioning to European leadership.
Wait. For those of us who don't spend our days, studying NATO org charts, why does handing over Naples and Norfolk matter so much? Like, what do those commands actually do?
Well, they are essentially the operational nervous system. Norfolk secures the transatlantic supply lines,
Okay.
the literal physical ocean routes that would keep Europe supplied in a major war, and Naples oversees the Mediterranean and the southern flank.
Oh, wow.
So by relinquishing leadership there, the U.S. is quite literally giving up the structural levers it has used to project unified transatlantic power since the Cold War.
That is huge. And the public sentiment completely reflects that institutional divorce, too. There's a data drop in the report that is just staggering to me.
The polling data, right.
Yeah. It notes that back in January 2026, after the U.S. made threats to annex Greenland, Danish public approval of the United States plummeted from 20% down to just 16%.
Yeah, that polling data is a leading indicator of policy. I mean, when public support drops that low, European leaders no longer face domestic political pressure to align with Washington.
All right, they face the opposite.
Exactly. Aligning with the U.S. becomes a political liability. The European Defense Commissioner actually stated that European strategic autonomy is no longer just an aspiration, it is active policy now.
The assumption of unconditional American commitment has basically been revised.
Fully revised.
So if the formal treaty-bound allies in Europe are pulling away and building their own autonomy, it puts immense pressure on America's informal security partners to pick up the slack, right? Specifically in the Middle East. But looking at the text, those informal hierarchies are violently fracturing too. In early 2026, right before the swings, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait flatly refused to let the U.S. use their airspace or bases to strike Iran.
Correct. The Gulf states were actively trying to position themselves as non-belligerent.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, remember, they had spent years cultivating this really fragile détente with Tehran, including that 2023 normalization agreement that was partially brokered by China.
Right, I remember that.
So they withheld access from the U.S. specifically to avoid being targeted in a regional war.
But the paradox and the deep irony here is that hedging their bets didn't work. Iran retaliated against them anyway.
Yeah, it did.
They launched over 6,400 missiles and drones in the first weeks of the conflict. And they hit devastating targets. Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery, the Riyadh International Airport, Dubai's Jebel Ali port.
And we really have to look at the mechanics of those strikes to understand the global impact. We aren't just talking about localized damage here.
Right.
Oil production across the region dropped by over 10 million barrels a day. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed down.
And that is a massive global choke point.
Massive. That closure alone disrupted 70% of the Gulf's food imports.
70%. Wow.
And it directly threatened the desalination plants that provide their drinking water.
But, okay, I want to push back on the idea that the U.S. alliance structure completely failed here.
Sure.
Because reading the timeline in the text, eventually these countries did let the U.S. back in, right? Like Saudi Arabia eventually approved access to King Fahd Air Base. Qatar actually shot down Iranian jets approaching its airspace.
Yes, that did happen.
So doesn't that mean the U.S. security hierarchy worked in the end, when push came to shove?
Well, that is exactly what Washington pointed to as a success. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, if you look under the hood of that compliance, the fundamental trust is broken.
Really?
Yeah, they complied under literal fire out of immediate survival necessity, not strategic alignment. And the text emphasizes that this kind of extreme volatility only accelerates their long-term hedging.
Meaning they want to build a world where they don't need to rely on the U.S.
Exactly. And specifically, that hedging looks like de-dollarization.
Okay, can we pause there for a second? Give us the ELI 5, explain like I'm 5 on the petrodollar and why this shift matters so much.
Sure. Simply put, for decades, global oil has been priced and sold almost exclusively in U.S. dollars. Because everyone needs oil, everyone needs dollars. That creates this massive global demand for U.S. currency, which then allows the U.S. government to borrow money cheaply and run large deficits.
Right, because there's always a buyer for the debt.
Exactly. But the report impartially outlines how that system is slowly eroding. The BRICS expansion in 2024 and 2025 pulled in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran.
Okay.
And furthermore, China is aggressively expanding its CIPS alternative.
And CIPS is essentially a rival to SWIFT, right?
Exactly. SWIFT is the messaging system banks use to move money across borders, and it is heavily influenced by the West. CIPS is China's alternative.
I see.
When you combine that alternative plumbing with the fact that Russia-China bilateral trade has shifted almost entirely to ruble-yuan settlements, you see the structure changing.
Yeah, the foundations are shifting.
Right. The U.S. dollar isn't collapsing tomorrow, but at the margins, the world is slowly building a financial system that bypasses Washington entirely.
Which brings us to the literal receipt for all this geopolitical maneuvering. If we really want to understand Noven's thesis on American overextension, we have to look at the brutal math of attrition.
The math is very revealing.
The numbers in this report genuinely stop me in my tracks.
Well, the asymmetric cost-exchange ratio is perhaps the most quantifiable evidence of the systemic strain we are discussing.
Right, because it's not just about who has the bigger military on paper. It's about how much it actually costs to use it.
Precisely.
Like the text notes, Iran is manufacturing over 100 offensive missiles every single month. Meanwhile, the U.S. only manufactures 96 interceptors in an entire year.
Yeah.
Why is there such a massive gap?
It comes down to the inherent difference between offense and defense in modern warfare. Iran is mass-producing relatively cheap, crude, but highly effective offensive drones and missiles.
Right.
The U.S. AD system, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, is an incredibly complex, precision-engineered defensive shield.
It's high-tech.
Very. Building one requires advanced microelectronics, incredibly tight manufacturing tolerances, specialized labor. You simply cannot mass-produce a Tadal interceptor the way you can stamp out a drone fuselage.
And that asymmetry just bleeds the U.S. dry. Like, by day 12 of the Iran war, the conflict had cost $16.5 billion.
It's an astronomical burn rate.
The Pentagon burned through over half of its entire pre-war inventory of Tomahawk cruise missiles in a matter of weeks. And now they are begging Congress for a $200 billion supplemental package just to recover.
And we must connect this Middle Eastern conflict to the broader Pacific theater to really see the strategy.
How so?
The U.S. recovery timeline to rebuild those depleted stockpiles is artificially extended by Chinese economic statecraft.
Wait, really?
Yes. Back in 2025, China restricted the export of rare earth minerals. Those minerals are absolutely crucial inputs for manufacturing the F-35 stealth fighter and advanced radar systems.
So the U.S. is burning through weapons rapidly, and the supply chain to rebuild them is being choked by their biggest global competitor.
Precisely. And China is actively learning from this. The text refers to the Iran conflict as a, quote, live fire intelligence dividend for Beijing.
A live fire intelligence dividend.
Yeah. They are observing how Iran's cheap, overwhelming drone swarms forced the U.S. to expend multi-million-dollar interceptors.
Right, the cost exchange we talked about.
Exactly. And China is taking those lessons and accelerating their own AI-enabled drone swarms, explicitly designing technology to replicate those cost-imposing tactics for a potential future Taiwan contingency.
Which creates this absolute macroeconomic catch-22 back home in the United States. And this is the part of the deep dive that I found the most fascinating.
It's a very complex domestic bind.
Yeah, so let me walk through this. The military desperately needs that $200 billion to restock its weapons. But the domestic economy is in a structural bind. The report highlights the national debt is approaching $39 trillion.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is holding interest rates high at 3.5 to 3.75%.
Because inflation remains persistent, yeah.
Right.
And the carrying cost of a $39 trillion debt at those elevated interest rates means a massive portion of the federal budget goes strictly to paying interest.
Leaving less for everything else.
Exactly. It drastically constrains the fiscal space available to fund the military.
But here is the ultimate irony loop that the text points out. In early 2025, the U.S. placed massive 150% tariffs on Chinese imports, right? Aiming to damage China's economy.
That was the goal.
But the text explains those exact tariffs are actually keeping U.S. inflation high at 2.7% because consumer goods are artificially more expensive.
Yes.
So let me get this straight. The tariffs meant to hurt China, forced the Fed to keep interest rates high to fight inflation, which makes the $39 trillion national debt vastly more expensive to service, which limits the government's ability to fund the military needed to deter China.
That is the exact mechanism, yes.
It is a completely self-sustaining loop of friction.
It is a profound structural bind. The weaponization of trade has created an inescapable domestic headwind. And the text neutrally juxtaposes that American bind against China's macroeconomic posture. Yes, China has its own severe domestic challenges, particularly a very weak property sector.
Right, we've heard a lot about that.
But they are still projecting 4.5% GDP growth for 2026. And more structurally important is their state-coordinated industrial policy.
The text mentioned the new three, I think.
Yes, they are heavily subsidizing what they call the new 3 electric vehicles, advanced batteries, and renewable energy infrastructure.
So while the U.S. is operationally consumed by fighting a war in the Middle East and fighting a debt spiral at home, China is basically consolidating dominance over the supply chains of the future.
Exactly.
Okay, so what does this all mean? We have to bring this back to the core question of the text.
Right, the boiling frog.
Right. Is China orchestrating all this deliberately? Are they doing this on purpose to boil the American frog?
The report thoughtfully lays out 3 distinct analytical frameworks for interpreting this dynamic.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first is deliberate strategy. This suggests China is consciously and actively orchestrating these cascading crises.
And is there evidence for that?
There is. The report points out that China provided covert logistical support to Iran. Specifically, they supplied sodium perchlorate, which is a critical missile fuel precursor,
Wow.
all while Beijing publicly played the role of a neutral diplomatic mediator.
I mean, covertly supplying missile fuel precursors while preaching peace, that sounds like a highly deliberate strategy to me.
It is a compelling argument, but the second framework is opportunistic adaptation.
Okay, how does that differ?
This interpretation suggests China isn't necessarily the arsonist starting the fires, but they have a highly sophisticated fire department that excels at exploiting the chaos.
Ah, I see.
They just patiently fill the power vacuums left whenever the U.S. gets distracted by a new crisis.
But the text argues neither of those tells the full story, right?
Correct. Novin argues the most robust framework is the third one, systemic convergence.
Systemic convergence.
Yeah. This posits that the U.S. and China are simply operating on two fundamentally different strategic clocks.
Different clocks.
Yes. The U.S. is trapped in a short-cycle reactive loop, putting out immediate geopolitical fires, managing quarterly economic data, navigating rapid election cycles.
Very short-term focused.
Right. Whereas China is playing a long-cycle game focused on patient capital deployment and structural positioning over decades.
Okay.
When those two tempos interact, it naturally produces an asymmetric advantage for the long-cycle player. Beijing doesn't need to mastermind every crisis. They just need to let the structural friction wear the U.S. down.
Though it's worth noting, the text makes it clear China isn't completely immune to that friction.
Oh, certainly not.
Like when the Strait of Hormuz closed, it didn't just hurt the West. It disrupted 42% of China's oil imports from the Gulf.
Right.
So the water in the pot is getting warm for them too.
They are definitely feeling the heat, although they are somewhat insulated by massive strategic petroleum reserves. But you're right, systemic pressures affect the entire global system.
So where does this go?
Well, looking forward, the report outlines 3 modeled scenarios for how this dynamic resolves by the year 2030.
Let's walk through those. What is the most likely outcome?
The highest probability scenario is the attrition trap.
Attrition trap.
Yes, this is essentially the continuation of the status quo. The U.S. remains bogged down in a reactive crisis loop. Defense industrial capacity remains strained by persistent low-level conflicts, and alternative architectures like BRICS and CIPS slowly, methodically erode American financial dominance.
So the frog boils 1 degree at a time.
Exactly.
That sounds like a slow, painful bleed. Is there a scenario where the U.S. realizes the water's getting hot and just forcefully changes course?
There is. The medium probability scenario is called Fortress America.
Fortress America. What does that look like?
This involves a deliberate, radical U.S. strategic reset. Washington basically accepts the reality of a fractured, highly transactional world and pivots entirely inward to focus on aggressive reindustrialization and securing domestic supply chains.
Just pulling up the drawbridge.
Right. And the text impartially notes that legislation like the CHIS and Science Act, the Green Infrastructure Investments from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the 2025 Trump administration's acquisition of strategic stakes in Intel and MP Materials, which mines rare earths, all form the early structural foundations for this state-directed capitalist reset.
Okay, so it's a hardening of the American shell.
Okay.
Okay, so you have the slow bleed, and you have America pulling up the drawbridge.
Hmm.
What if the rest of the world just decides they're sick of being caught between these two superpowers?
That is the third scenario, multipolar fragmentation.
Okay.
It carries a low to medium probability. In this model, middle powers like India, the European Union, the Gulf states, they decide that navigating the U.S.-China competition is just too costly.
So what do?
They actively dismantle the remnants of the 1945 global order and build their own highly regional, independent economic and security architectures.
Wow.
Yeah, it creates a deeply fragmented world where global coordination on things like trade or climate change becomes almost impossibly complex and expensive.
So, for you listening, why does it matter to understand the difference between CIPS and SWIFT? Or, the manufacturing timeline of a thought interceptor?
It's all connected.
Exactly. It matters because this framework fundamentally changes how you process the news. It shows you that a localized event, like a new tariff on imported goods, or a blocked strait in the Persian Gulf, or a public opinion poll in Denmark, none of these exist in isolation.
Not at all.
They are deeply intertwined mechanisms within a massive, shifting global engine. The real danger highlighted in this deep dive isn't necessarily some comic book villain pulling every string from the shadows. The danger is the compounding daily cost of one's own structural drift.
And that actually raises a vital question that the text only hints at, but which I really want to leave you to mull over.
Oh, let's hear it.
We've talked extensively today about how these systemic pressures produce outcomes that no single adversary needs to manually engineer, right?
Right.
But consider the role of emerging technology here. We
Yeah.
discussed China developing AI-enabled drone swarms.
Yeah.
Well, as artificial intelligence increasingly begins to model, optimize, and actively dictate these complex, asymmetric cost exchange strategies for militaries on both sides,
Oh, wow.
do we risk creating a scenario where the algorithms themselves accelerate this global boiling process faster than human diplomats can even realize what's happening?
That is a genuinely chilling thought.
Yeah,
The water isn't just getting warmer, the stove might soon be operating itself.
exactly.
Well, we want to warmly thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, look for the mechanics behind the headlines, and we will catch you on the next one.